We see strong growth in Saudi, in Jordan, and in Oman, as well as in Israel as well.
In my previous episode with Yogurt Chatzimarkakis, we learned that Saudi Arabia is intending to use a $110 billion oil field exclusively for the production of blue hydrogen. That's just one great example of how much the energy transition in the Middle East is proceeding and picking up speed. Another great example is that the Middle East Energy Transition reports that there were no contract awards for oil-powered or gas-fueled power stations in the Middle East and North Africa region in the first half of 2021, while in the same period there were about 2.8 billion of renewable energy project contract awards in the region. Is this a steady trend that will continue just like that into the future? And if so, what are the biggest drivers behind it? And most importantly, what are the differences in the various countries spread out in the region? Let's find out in this episode. Welcome to the Smartery Podcast, a podcast for and with the creators of the new energy world. A world in which energy will be renewable, decentralized, and digital, bringing together electricity, heat, and mobility. Let us show you how we will get there and who will get us there. My guest today is Benjamin Attia. He is a senior research analyst and part of the energy transition practice at Mackenzie Power Renewables, also known as WoodMac. He leads their coverage of the power and energy transition in the Middle East and Africa, but is dialing in from Boston today. Glad to have you on the podcast. Welcome, Benjamin.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So Benjamin, will zero in on the MENA region today. What does your personal involvement with the MENA region look like at the moment?
Yeah, so I lead the coverage of the Middle East and Africa for the power sector and the energy transition, and have also been doing quite a bit of work on solar in the region for the last 5 or 6 years at WoodMac. So very happy to be involved in the the planning process for Intersolar Middle East coming up in March, and I'm very happy to be chatting today. Thanks for having me.
What's quite interesting for us from our standpoint is that the Middle East is always associated in Europe in the wake of green hydrogen. It's one of the most promising future production grounds for green hydrogen, I assume. So, and we also had one guest here, Cornelius Mattes, that's quite a few episodes ago already, who spoke extensively about the quite ambitious plans of Dubai, for example, when it comes to green hydrogen. So what are the current developments? What has happened in the past 12 months during COVID also?
Yeah, so I mean, we've certainly seen a lot of hype and a lot of buzz about green hydrogen around the world, and particularly in the Middle East, where we see that electricity costs, particularly from renewables, have dropped to globally record lows. So we've seen prices just kissing $10 per megawatt hour in Saudi Arabia, and of course low prices from solar in the UAE, in Qatar, in Oman, and in a few other markets in the region as well, leading the world on sort of lowest cost electricity. But alongside that, some of the things that kind of give us a little bit of optimism around the hydrogen space is that the cost of electrolyzers is continuing to decline, albeit a bit slowly. And we see some of the round trip efficiency gains going up a bit as well. But just a little bit of context on hydrogen is, we still see that, about 99.5% of the current hydrogen production globally is still not green hydrogen. It's still gray. We have some blue hydrogen and some brown as well. So we see that, maybe in the next 8 to 10 years, around the 2028, 2030 timeframe, we'll see prices that kind of start to come below $2 per kilogram. And then maybe in some markets, $1 per kilogram, around that range. But it really does depend on very low electricity prices as an input and high utilization rates for those electrolyzers, which, without wholesale markets and high renewable penetration that is increasingly being curtailed, that's still a little bit ways away. So this is sort of a medium to long-term evolution. Although we're seeing a lot of big announcements right now, the reality is that the sector is still very early on, and there's still some challenges, particularly with subsidized electricity and fuel prices. It can be difficult for green hydrogen to be cost competitive if you have heavily subsidized gas or even in some cases, HFO in the power sector.
All right, I see. So in regards to hydrogen, it's still a development that's going to come to fruition in rather mid to long-term scales. If we look at solar, I guess it's a different picture. According to the Middle East Solar Industry Association, MESIA, the MENA market will be worth more than 20 billion by 2024 already. Would you agree with that? What's your take on that?
Yeah, we see pretty aggressive growth in the solar market in the region. And the market has been sort of historically or recently characterized by fierce tariff competition and oversubscription. So as I mentioned, we've seen some of the lowest solar costs in the world have been awarded in most of the markets in the Middle East, in Saudi, the UAE, Qatar, Oman, and others. We've seen some extremely low prices going well below $20 per megawatt hour, approaching 10. And, that's been sort of the defining characteristic of the region's solar market, that the market is relatively thin on the utility scale side. It's just about all public procurements, top-down government-led tenders that are extremely competitive, many times oversubscribed, that leave a lot of sort of very, very competitively priced capacity on the table, but have driven that leading edge bid very, very, very competitively down. And part of the reason for that is abundant solar resource. Part of the reason for that is extremely cheap and public capital. Part of that is some sort of ruthless cost optimization from some of the key players in the region who have kind of pushed the boundaries of OpEx and sort of EPC cost stacks, who are taking sort of aggressive views on the life cycles of some of the renewable technology, and are increasingly and almost immediately the industry in the region adopted bifacial modules for all of these recent bids because they perform quite well in desert environments. So we've seen a lot of growth in that area, on sort of the optimization front of those tenders. But the pace of market growth in the utility scale segment is still determined by the sort of cadence of public sector sort of top-down competitive procurements, the National Renewable Energy Program in Saudi, and the sort of series of tenders from Dubai and DEWA in Dubai, and the Suehan project and the following projects for Noor in Abu Dhabi as well. So those tenders are sort of what determines the pace of growth. So it's a bit choppy, right? We see very large tenders kind of coming, not necessarily at a regular cadence in most places so far. So that kind of makes it a bit chunky as the demand grows and those projects get completed. But we have seen, very low attrition for those projects. Just about all the projects that have been announced are actually built and completed on time at cost. And we've seen some pretty aggressive ambitions from the region's electricity sectors as well. So we expect strong growth.
All right. So you threw out quite a lot of insights about the dynamic there and also where it's coming from. In my own words, mainly a dynamic, is that correct, that's driven by state actors pushing a very ambitious agenda, and hence the chunky development that you mentioned. So what does it look like if you look at the behind the meter dynamic?
Yeah, good question. So it's much more bottom up. There's a relatively limited number of markets that do have active behind the meter segments, and one of the main reasons for that is there needs to be a price differential between behind the meter solar and the utility tariff, which in many places is still subsidized at the retail level. There have been some efforts for reform in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, in Jordan, but those efforts have been sort of progressed in some places like Jordan, where the cost of electricity is actually quite high. And in markets like Egypt and in Saudi, those reforms have been a little bit more gradual or slow going. And in Egypt, were actually slowed down because of COVID. So as a result of that, there are less markets where the sort of electricity cost savings from behind the meter solar is worth it or profitable based on the retail electricity subsidies. However, we do still have bullish expectations. We see that about cumulatively by 2026, we'll expect about 3.5 gigawatts of C&I solar in the Middle East. And that's about 450 to 500 megawatts per year of annual demand starting in 2023. And this is primarily concentrated in the UAE, in Abu Dhabi and Dubai, but also some new emirates that are releasing net metering policies. We see strong growth in Saudi, in Jordan, and in Oman, as well as in Israel as well. And this is also supported by some national renewable targets and by sort of procurements from a few key sectors, particularly in the industrial and retail segments. So we see strong growth. It's a relatively small piece of the total electricity market, but we see strong sort of growth from a relatively small base in the markets where the economics do pencil.
What are some of the key technical aspects or the latest technical developments that are happening parallel to that development?
So rooftop solar is a relatively mature technology. So we are seeing some efforts in innovation on the inverter side, as well as behind the meter battery storage, which in most markets, according to our analysis, doesn't really pencil because the market mechanisms don't really compensate for behind the meter generation, and there's no sort of reliability issues in most of these markets. So we are seeing a lot of sort of technology movement on sort of the power electronic side of things, sort of for cost optimization and performance optimization for net metered projects. And then also on the storage side, although the market for behind the meter storage in the Middle East is pretty small, to be frank.
So Benjamin, you already spoke about rooftop solar. How about wind? And it does sound like there's some exciting projects. Like, for example, you have the Dumat Al Chandal, the largest wind farm in the Middle East that was just successfully connected to the grid in Saudi Arabia. Can provide, I think, around 70,000 homes and saves around 1 million tons of CO2 per year. Is that a significant development in your eyes?
It is, yeah. And there's a good bit of procurement on the wind side in Saudi. There's some movement in the market in Egypt as well. But the wind sector in comparison to solar, both on the sort of utility scale segment where they actually do compete, and then also the fact that solar has distributed growth as well. We actually expect about 10 times more solar capacity than wind in the region through 2025. So while we do have expectations of about 6 or 6.5 gigawatts of wind capacity by that time frame, we're a little bit more focused on the solar sector at the moment because the demand is much higher.
Well, 1 to 10, that is a significant difference.
It is.
Also, if you look at the ecosystem that it will create, that means just solar will dominate, basically. What are the next steps and developments we might see in the Middle East energy transition?
Yeah. So, I think one of the big questions is going to be sort of around pricing. In the solar side, we are seeing price spikes at the moment in steel and polysilicon that have caused some centralized procurement programs that have very small margins on the bids because the bids are already quite low. And, presumably regulators want to see the next round of bids bring even lower prices. So where there's not a whole lot of room there, I'm expecting to see some sort of stalls or some delays potentially in the next rounds being opened until those supply chain issues, particularly for steel and polysilicon, begin to alleviate, which is something we expect to happen around the middle of next year, maybe towards the end of 2022. So on the solar side, that may cause some delays, but then also on pricing, right? So the final bid results for some of these tenders, do have a little bit more room to fall, but you really have to get creative around some of the assumptions for land and financing costs and technology lifetimes and some of these things to start to achieve some of those bids. So it's possible that we may see some corrections and the bids in the next rounds may actually go up. It's possible that we need some of this very low cost electricity to be produced in either for dedicated green hydrogen production or as surplus in the power sector. So that's something else to keep in mind as a low cost input for green hydrogen in the future. And then the last thing I think we're seeing is more regional interconnection of electricity markets. So as these sectors sort of slowly begin to unbundle in the markets where that is expected to happen, these interconnections will enable some wholesale market mechanisms in the long term. Whereas right now, really the cross-border electricity trade that we're seeing and sort of the export markets for power are pretty bilateral, and they kind of only consist of bulk power sales, which leaves a bit of an open question for the long-term future of renewable grids in the region.
Mm-hmm. So some questions still to be answered in the coming years. Could it be that in the not so far away future, maybe next year already, that we could there's a turning point in the energy transition for the MENA region? Obviously, its legacy is in oil and gas, but nowadays, with the development of oil and gas prices, with the falling renewable energy prices, and the discussions about stranded assets, how much is it really changing there? Or do they still see that even if we turn around, there's still so much need for oil and gas and for at least the next 30, 40, 50 years that they do not really push that hard?
Yeah, I think there's sort of a few different pathways forward, and it's maybe not helpful in this question to generalize the answer for the entire region because there are different countries that will take different approaches. But in some markets, we see the natural low cost sort of greening of the power sector that may or may not trickle into sort of the upstream oil and gas sector and sort of the future expectations or plans of some of the NOCs in the region. Some of them do have some investment arms that are kind of looking into the renewable space or have made some investments in the renewable space. But on the whole, there's a pretty big chasm between what the electricity sector looks like and the sort of growth of renewables and electric vehicles and storage and even green hydrogen in the in the medium to long term, and sort of the export oriented nature of the NOCs and their strategies. So it's a little difficult to connect those dots, but I think market by market, we do see that some of the big ambitions for renewable targets and the decarbonization of power are likely to be met in the region, in part because of these low costs, in part because of the very readily available and low cost financing. But whether or not that sort of trickles into sort of non-power sectors maybe remains to be seen.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but if I get it right, there are quite a few very exciting projects, singular projects as well. Like you have that big wind farm, you have a big oil field committed to the production of green or blue hydrogen. You have massive ramp up of solar energy. But there is still a lot of groundwork to be done when it really comes to infrastructure and the creation of markets. Would that be a fair sum up of all the points you put out there?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, there's certainly a lot of work to be done on the infrastructure side and also on the policy side to enable private investment in infrastructure. So the creation of markets that properly value front-of-the-meter energy storage or create wholesale markets for non-dispatchable renewable power, ways to compensate curtailment that could otherwise be redirected towards green hydrogen. These sorts of questions that are sort of still yet to be answered, because the region's power sector is still vertically integrated and sort of focused on publicly owned electricity sectors and publicly run tenders.
On the upside, I guess, that region really has the potential to move fast once the goals are set, probably faster than we can here in Europe with all the different decision making that has to be negotiated. So it seems like they will hit their target, even though they set themselves very ambitious targets. So you said yourself in the beginning that you are going to hopefully travel to the Intersolar Middle East conference in March 2022. What are maybe the two things you're most looking forward to?
Yeah, no, I'm quite excited. I've been part of the executive steering committee this time around and helping to set the agenda, which has been very exciting. And I'm looking forward to heading back and seeing a lot of familiar faces and hearing, about some of the latest technology developments and hopefully some candid insights on where we see some of the future bid prices going in the renewables markets. So I'm quite keen about that and looking forward to participating.
Oh, I think you will have a blast. To me, it was already really amazing to meet actual people live and in person at the Smarter E restart in Munich a couple of weeks ago. So I'm quite sure you'll enjoy it just as much at the Intersolar in Dubai. Thanks a lot for having joined me today, Benjamin.
Yeah, thanks very much. Cheers. Appreciate you having me.
Everything about the latest developments in renewable energy, from solar to green hydrogen to storage, can be found at the Intersolar Middle East Conference 2022, taking place March 7th to 9th, 2022 in Dubai. All info about the conference can be found as well online at intersolar.ae.